it's great to be with you. And again, I work for Fuller Seminary. My name is Jake Mulder, and it is wonderful to have each of you here. Our topic this time around is the dark side of intergenerational worship. Okay, the dark side of intergenerational worship. This is a workshop session, so I would love to have interaction. I will pause every so often to invite questions. So please do chat questions in along the way, and I can stop and interact with those. I can't see them come through, so I will just make sure to pause periodically and invite questions, and we can go from there. So with that, I'm going to share my screen. You should be able to access these slides in the materials that were provided. And here we go. So I am specifically zeroing in on this session on intergenerational ministry and young people specifically. So if you hear young people come out in my language, part of that is I am a director at the Fuller Youth Institute. So that's my area of specialty and expertise. John 10:10, this verse summarizes what I hope for young people and for all people in the church. And that is that young people specifically would know the full, abundant life that Jesus invites them into. Now, I don't think that that's necessarily an easy life or a life that is free from struggle or challenge. It doesn't mean that they're just healthy, wealthy, happy, those sorts of things. But I really do think that Jesus invites us into the life that is truly life. And when I think about what I want the church to be, when I think about the church I want my kids to experience, it's a church that invites them to know Jesus, and it is a church that invites them into the life that is truly life. Part of the case that I want to make in this talk is that in many ways, our best opportunity to invite young people into the life that's truly life is going to come through intergenerational interactions, through intergenerational worship, and through the intergenerational relationships that we can develop. My sense is if I were to ask you about the young people who you know and what you hope or dream for them, you could give me a long list of the things that you hope and dream for the young people who you know. I would really invite you to consider and kind of hold in your heart during this talk one or two young people specifically who you know about, who you care about, and who you value. So with that, I want to introduce you to the reality that the vast majority of a significant portion, we will say, of young people in the church today are not necessarily experiencing the full, abundant life that Jesus invites them into. If you were in a talk that I gave earlier, you would have seen this statistic. The reality we have right now is about half of those who are high school youth group graduates end up drifting from God, drifting from the church after high school. So in many ways, what we are doing when it comes to our faith formation, development, discipleship of a younger generation for about half of those who are growing up in the church is not necessarily working. And I want to propose that the way that our church is divided, in many ways, we could refer to it as a two-table church. Okay, a two-table church. And you may have already gathered that this photo, this is a Thanksgiving photo. Maybe you can tell from some of the food choices that are there. But this one is the Thanksgiving photo where there is very clearly an adults table and there is a kids table, right? An adults table and a kids table. And at the adults table, it tends to be that our food is a little fancier. We have dishware and cups that can be broken, so we handle them carefully. The adults table is usually a little more calm and balanced and respectful. The kids table, you see the sort of things going on that are happening at this kids table. The food choices might be a little different and less fancy. There are plastic cups that are not going to be broken. There are paper plates that are not going to be shattered. And even the expressions, you know, a little more awkward, a little bit more crazy. I don't know. This looks like a fun table to be at. But in many of our churches, there is a difference between what happens at the adults table and the kids table. Now, I want to invite you to chat in, if you're willing. What does if you have, let's compare this to your church, right? If your church has an adults table and a kids table, how do those two things look different? Okay, if we can compare the adults table and kids table in our church, and we can say the adults table is often the adult worship service, and there's things that are activities and ministries that are oriented towards adults. And then there's the whole set of activities that are oriented towards children's ministry, youth ministry, college ministry, young adult ministry. I'm just curious if the kids table and adults table setup exists in your church. What does that look like? What are some of the things that define the adults table versus the kids table? We'll give it just a second here to see if anyone has anything to chat in. And as we wait for that, if we don't get anything in just a second, I can add a few myself. But I'm curious, what defines the differences between the adults table and the kids table in your church? And Leah, I'm going to assume you are intelligent as well, so not to put you on the spot, but if you want to add anything, you are certainly invited to. All right, maybe a couple things will come in the chat in a minute. When I think about the churches that I have worked for, worshiped in, okay, so we've got CCM versus hymnody. Thank you for adding there, Leah. When I think about the churches that I've worshiped in, that I have worked in, and that I work with in my role now, there's a certain convenience to the kids table and the adults table because we don't have to fight some of the battles. All right, awesome. We've got Cheryl chatting in. The adults table is more formal. The children leave worship and go to children's church. Yes. And I will say for youth ministry specifically with some of the churches that I've interacted with, at the kids table, I mean, the activities, the music is louder. The activities might be a little bit more risky. The messages tend to be not quite as deep. Aaron adding fun games are at the kids table, serious study at the adults table. Now, much of this approach to have the kids table and the adults table is valuable and important. We want to make sure we are programming and discipling to the level that people are at. But I want to propose that there are some weaknesses and some challenges to this kids table, adults table mentality. Let me go back to sharing screen here. All right, so if we look at the kids table and the adults table, one of the things that we are known for at the Fuller Youth Institute is a book called Sticky Faith. And Sticky Faith was looking at why do some young people drift from their faith, and then why do others stick with their faith, and what can we learn from those two experiences? So we set out to study several hundred young people, and we looked at, for those who stuck with their faith, what was it that led their faith to stick? And what we found was out of 13 youth group variables, so all these variables within youth ministry, the strongest correlations of helping young people's faith stick came through intergenerational relationships and intergenerational worship. So when you look at, is it the games? Is it the mission trips? Is it the Bible studies? Is it this? Is it that? The strongest correlations of what helped young people's faith stick were when those young people had developed intergenerational relationships and when they participated in intergenerational worship. Now, we are not saying that you need to eliminate all children's and youth ministry activities in your church. We have sometimes been accused of that, well, if intergenerational worship and relationships are what helps form faith, then Fuller Youth Institute, you must be saying that you need to get rid of all children's and youth ministry. Hear me very clearly. That is not what I'm saying. Here's a few other things that I am not saying. There's one church that I've worked with from some research that we've done on churches that are growing young. And in that research, they heard what we talked about with this whole idea of intergenerational worship and ministry. So this church decided to go all in, and they didn't talk to us first, but they just said, okay, previously we've had generations separated. We are now going to bring everyone together in the same worship service. There's going to be babies who will be crying. There will be teenagers on their devices. There will be adults in their 40s or 50s who are paying attention. There will be people in their 70s and 80s, and we're just all going to be together in worship. And because they didn't do it in a very nuanced way, it did not go well for them. And this happened to be a church that about every 6 months, they would kind of change the vision and focus of what they were geared on and what they were focused on. And they decided to take a seeker-sensitive turn. And they decided, okay, that was the last 6 months. These next 6 months, we're going to be more evangelistic and outreach-oriented. And when they did that, they had a couple new visitors who said, hey, at most churches that I've been to, I kind of drop my kids off and then I come in. I don't really like having my kids in worship with me. So the pastor ended up writing us an email and said, hey, I tried your whole intergenerational worship thing. It didn't work. We care about evangelism, so we're not going to do that intergenerational worship thing anymore. That is kind of an example over here of what we're not talking about when we're talking about intergenerational ministry. On the other side, what I want to avoid is we've seen some churches that just, they force young people to be in worship, but they do not take the time to listen to or consider young people's perspectives. We've seen this done poorly with some churches who decide, okay, we're going to move to intergenerational worship. However, every sermon series is targeted to someone who is in their 50s or 60s, who is married, who has teenage or young adult children. And it's Bible studies that involve, or it's sermons that involve what to do about your mortgage, how to navigate marriage when you've been married for 20, 30 years, not topics that are relevant to teenagers. So I would say that is that it is often not done well. Here's the question that I really want to get into in this session. If there really can be a dark side of intergenerational worship, if we shouldn't be thinking, okay, it's fully this way or it's fully this way, which one are we going to do? The question in my mind is, how can we wisely pursue and implement intergenerational worship? How can we wisely pursue and implement intergenerational worship? What I want to do is really give you 3 main points to consider for what that work might look like in your church. So let me move into those. The first one is the importance of empathy. The importance of empathy. And I mentioned our sticky faith research. We have built on that with some research called Growing Young. And in Growing Young, sticky faith, we were studying teenagers. Growing Young, we were studying churches. And in Growing Young, we were trying to figure out what are the commonalities in churches that have a thriving ministry with teenagers and young adults. And one of the things that we took away is the importance of empathy and empathizing with young people. Now, when we talk about empathy, here's what we mean. We mean feeling with young people. It's sitting on the curb with them. It's being close enough to understand what they're thinking, feeling, what they're interested in. It's not simply being frustrated or pointing fingers or being judgmental towards them. I could tell you what empathy is. I would rather show you what empathy looks like. And so I am going to go ahead and play a video. And I have not tried playing a video quite yet on this. So we are going to go ahead and do this. And if for some reason the video does not work well, if it's like 3 minutes of silence, then I will be back in about 3 minutes and we'll keep talking. But I'm going to hope that this video plays well. It is the story of Natalie and Jazzy in a congregation called Fellowship Memphis Church. So go ahead and watch the video, and then I will share with you a little bit more about this church.
Discipleship was not a word that I heard growing up. No one said, oh, I disciple so-and-so. We just kind of did it. The Lord was pushing me to step out and essentially started learning the message of discipleship. Kind of felt like a burning bush experience where the Lord was like, it's time to start passing that on. So the next question is like, oh, well, great. To who?
My family had come to fellowship when I was in the 7th grade, and they put me in a youth group. And I didn't like youth group because I'm an old church. I was the only black kid in my youth group. I didn't want to feel singled out. I had the worst attitude. I didn't want to be there.
We were all in this tiny room, 4 middle school, high school girls, and I barely know any of them. I thought, all right, there could be a divine appointment in this room. So I'm just going to keep praying, and I'm going to wait. I'm going to let God speak. And I kid you not, there was one in the room who was like not having anything artificial.
And she sat beside me, and I was like, who is this woman? Like, why is she here? Like, she's 20-something, and she keeps talking to us and wants to be like our Sunday school teacher, but it's not even Sunday school. But she like had this gentle like persistence about her that I didn't notice.
That night, I just started dreaming of this young girl. Sometimes we were going on walks. Sometimes we were going on runs. Sometimes we were sitting around at a table. And I thought, okay, I'm going to ask her to coffee because 13-year-olds like coffee.
I was 13, 14, didn't drink coffee. I was like, I mean, I guess. I don't have nothing else to do. Are you going to pick me up?
I knew it was an obedient move. I want to have it all together, but Lord, I don't know what's next. I'm sitting at coffee with a 13-year-old. I don't know what to say. It's like, just pursue an honest conversation. Just talk to her.
I remember she asked me a question about like someone's relationship in the youth group. I think they're going to break up. And usually if I talk to an adult like that about another adult, the adult would say like, well, you don't know anything, like you're just a little girl, or like that's rude, how do you know? But she didn't say that to me. She kind of had a conversation with me about what I just said, and it wasn't a conversation of like correction. It was just a conversation between a person and a person. I mean, when you're 13 and you're in school and you have parents and everyone's older than you and telling you what to do, but then this one person comes into your life and like, here's what you say. I'm really emotional, but that like melted my heart. And I think that gave like she could have said anything to me after that and I would have hurt her. So I mean, she calls me her sister, and we're sisters.
People are not projects. We started sitting down and meeting. We were for sure going to see each other on Sundays, but all of a sudden a project didn't emerge. There wasn't this point where I go, okay, I'm discipling you and you're my disciple. It expanded what I really think that God meant discipleship to be. This has been the one thing where I feel that I've been blessed in every way. She's a gift. She's a little sister. It's just meant the world to me.
See people as people. Don't come with all the answers and all the help, but have a conversation with someone and taking things slow and looking at people as if they're royalty, because they are. Treat people like people, like they're your friend, and actually mean it in your heart.
All right. So first question, can someone chat in whether you were able to see and hear that? I am very hopeful that you were able to, but it would help me. Okay. Leah is saying yes. It takes away a lot of the emotional power of the video when I just need to describe it myself. So I'm very glad to hear that the answer to that was yes. Yeah, when we think about what empathy is and what empathy looks like, it is very much what Natalie and Jazzy display in the video there, where it wasn't just a matter of an older person telling a younger person what to do, but it was very much a circumstance of a give and a take and a back and a forth and a willingness to step into, on the part of the older woman in the video, to step into the perspective of the younger one. A couple of comments that I want to make on that. I'm going to go back to sharing my slides here. She made this comment in the video where she said, people are not projects. And I think that this is very important for us to keep in mind when we're thinking about worship. I think it's very easy sometimes for us to see people either as a project or simply an age group or a demographic, or they like the way we do worship or they don't like the way we do worship, but to treat people as individuals with personal nuance and interest and difference, rather than beginning to see them, not just beginning, but continuing to see them as a project. One other way that you could say that we should approach worship, especially if we're going to move towards intergenerational worship, is that this is something we do with the young people. This is something we form in conversation with the young people, letting them be part of planning it, rather than it just being something that, say, a very small committee decides this is how we're going to do it. The second thing that I would emphasize if you are going to move towards intergenerational worship is the need for warm community. This is another one of those core commitments that stands out from our Growing Young research. And one of the pieces that we are pushing against is some myths that we think are related to engaging young people. And during our research, when we were looking at churches that are thriving with young people, we heard several myths or assumptions come up. Some people thought, well, if we want to have young people in our worship service, we have to have in our church period, we have to have a big budget. That's going to take a lot of money. And we found not true. We found a lot of people assumed young people will only be attracted to contemporary worship or to some sort of worship that is modern, cutting edge. I know that terms here can become dangerous, so that's why we've got contemporary in quotes, or that the service has to have some sort of off the charts cool quotient. And we're not opposed to a church having a big budget, a church engaging in contemporary worship, or a church that does try to have a certain cool factor to it. The simple principle that I want to talk about here is what we found more than any of those things is that young people said they wanted a church that was warm. And when we say warm, they didn't use the phrase warm. When the phrases that they used were things like this. I want a church that's welcoming. I want a church that's accepting. I want a church where I can find a sense of belonging. I want a church that's authentic and where I can be authentic. I want a church that's hospitable. I want a church that's caring. Those were the sort of words and phrases that young people ended up using in our study. And what was interesting was that young people often talked about the sense or quality of the church that they wanted, things like warmth, much more often than they talked about a specific worship style. To go even a little further, we found a number of young adults, especially, who are very drawn to more of a high church and even traditional form of worship because of the warmth and the community and the connection that was involved there. Not all young people are looking for a worship pastor in skinny jeans and whatever you might associate with that sort of approach. Another piece that I would add to this is, as part of warmth, the fact that relationships matter greatly. Now, this is a picture of a Nazarene church. It's Emmanuel Church of the Nazarene, and the older gentleman here is Bill Wallace. One of the churches, this church that we studied, was thriving with teenagers and young adults. And when we talked to the teenagers and young adults and said, okay, so why do you like this church? Is it simply because of the worship style? Because their worship style, they had intergenerational worship, but it was fairly modern, cutting edge. And the teenagers and young adults said, well, yeah, the worship is okay, but that's not the main draw for why we come to this church. And they pointed to people like Bill Wallace and others who are investing in those and forming relationships across the generations. And they said, we really come to this church for the sense of community, connection, and relationship. Yes, the worship is important. We do engage in the worship, but the worship is not the only draw for us to this church. So as you're thinking about intergenerational worship, one of the things I want to invite you to respect and consider is, how do you make sure that this isn't just a musical performance and a sermon? How are we actually taking time inside the worship service and outside the worship service to facilitate connection and to facilitate relationships? Now, at this point, I am imagining that some of you are thinking, well, facilitating relationships, that really doesn't seem like my job. My job is to play an instrument, to sing, or lead worship in some other way. I think that that's exactly the point that I'm trying to make, is it may not officially be your job, and it may not be the primary thing that you are called to. But I do think the invitation in this next season of whatever the church is going to become is often for those who have one area of responsibility and another area of responsibility, and someone else has a different area of responsibility, to come together and ask, how do we make sure that the church is not just an isolated set of different things happening, but we really have a cohesive approach to what we're doing? So what that means practically, if you're going to move towards intergenerational worship, yes, we need to be intentional about the song selection. Yes, we need to be intentional about the flow of worship. Yes, we need to be intentional to make sure sermons and songs are chosen that can speak to different generations. It means we also need to be in conversation about how are we going to help people develop a depth of relationship and connection, because that is often what helps intergenerational worship go well. Interestingly, when we surveyed college students and we asked them, why are you involved in your church? Very rarely did they point towards programs specifically. About half of them pointed to the importance of relationships. We use this phrase that we think warmth in the church is the new cool. And we say that because when we asked pastors why they thought their church was effective with young people, and these are churches that were doing well with young people. When we asked the pastor, why do you think your church is doing well? They would talk quite a lot about the music. And when we talked to the younger people in the church, why are you a part of this church? It was half as often that the young people would mention the worship style. So again, what came out of that? Those who lead, pastors, worship leaders, etc., oftentimes we do tend to overemphasize the value of the music choice and music style for younger generations. If anybody wants to ask about that, feel free to put that in the chat, and we can have a dialogue about nuancing that data. Here's one more idea, and then we'll take some questions. I do still have a little more to share, but we'll take some questions in a minute. So please chat those in if you have them. One idea that can go along with that is for your worship gatherings to think about how they can be less like a theater and more like a family room. Okay, less like a theater and more like a family room. The idea of a theater is that you file in, you really don't interact with anyone else during it. You are faced forward on the performance that is happening at the front. A family room is much more interactive, much more comfortable in some ways. Now, I'm not telling you that if you have pews, you need to rip all of the pews out of your worship area. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm talking about is in the feel, in the ways that you give people to connect. Are you considering kind of family room idea that there is a sense of warmth and connection, or is it much more set up to be all action is on the stage? One of the youth leaders who was in our study said this, that in our church, oftentimes it feels like excellence is the death grip of warmth. We have such a desire to be excellent that it can eliminate the warmth. Now, I certainly believe that excellence honors God, and I have had that repeated to me several times. I also believe that Jesus was someone who displayed a sense of warmth and connection, and it's about finding the balance between those things. Rachel Held Evans, a Christian author who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, she wrote this: younger people today aren't looking for a hipper Christianity. We're looking for a truer Christianity, a more authentic Christianity. No coffee shops or fog machines required. All right, so in just a sec, I will go into my final point. But before I do that, I do want to take some questions. So please chat them in if you have them. Stephen has added one. So Stephen, let me go to your question here. You say, at Park Cities Baptist in Dallas, we offer a children's worship venue for two worship hours, where there's traditional worship and a contemporary service offered both hours. Many children attend these, but many attend the corporate hours in both venues. New Christian parents are served in some ways as they are not being distracted parenting, but I am wondering about continuity to come. Your thoughts? Yeah, Stephen, that's great. And I think you're wrestling with the issues at hand. Here's two comments on what you're saying. Part of what I like is I don't hear you saying it's a one size fits all and it's either this or it's this and we've made the decision that we're this. You're actually respecting and speaking into the nuance. So I appreciate that you're stepping into the nuance. The other thing that I would say to your question is I can certainly, as the parent of young children, appreciate having time where I am not distracted by my children. So I can connect with that. Part of what I would wonder is, okay, the church really is the whole set of people and activities who are part of the larger congregation. The worship service is one very important thing that we do within that set of activities. Now, if anyone wants to have a theological discussion, we can certainly do that. But what I would say is let the worship service be what the worship service is, continue much of what you're talking about doing here, but simply take the time to look at and supplement, okay, for these young people, for the children who are not being incorporated in the larger body or worship service, what are ways that we can build into our ministry programming to make sure that that actually happens? Now, if you are the worship leader, it's probably not your primary responsibility to say, how do we make sure that these young people are being surrounded by community and invested in and all that? Exactly the point. This might be an opportunity for you to connect with children's minister, youth leader, senior associate pastor at your church, and to pull together a discussion. And I can't think of a better, I would love to hear of more worship leaders pulling together this discussion to say, hey, here's what we're going to do for the worship service, but I really believe that that needs to be part of a larger plan. How can we make sure that we're forming that larger plan? I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'm going to go back for just a moment to sharing screen. Let me cover these final slides here, and then we will take the remaining time for discussion. The last point that I want to make, if we're going to do intergenerational worship well, I think that we need to make sure we are prioritizing young people everywhere throughout the church. This is one of those other key findings from our research on growing young. And if you're in the last session that I gave, I talked about this point. There was a senior pastor in our study who made this statement. He said, everyone in our church rises when we focus on young people. And the reason that he said that is about 20 years ago, their church decided to invest in the young people and young families in their church. And he said, you know, if you look at this diagram here, it's a pie chart. He said, if you look at this diagram here, what we tend to do is we give a certain piece of the pie, meaning a certain piece of the resource allocation and investment to different groups and ministries throughout the church. And he said, it's just simple math that if we'll give one slice to young people, there's going to be X amount of the pie for everyone else to go around. And he said it stands to reason that if we give young people a bigger slice, there's going to be less for everyone else to go around. But he said that's not the way that it happened in our church. He said 20 years ago, when we decided to invest more in young people and young families, we were very intentional to do that in ways that it wasn't a win-lose situation. And he said, when we did that over time, here's what happened. There wasn't less for everyone else to go around, but the whole pie actually ended up getting bigger. There were more people in our church who were giving more, who were sticking around more because of the intentional investment that we made. And I think for many of us, when it comes to intergenerational worship, we do need to ask the question, are we focused on those that we want to reach, or are we focused on those who we're trying to keep around? Now, that does not mean that we abandon an older generation, but it does mean that there are certain decisions that we're going to have to make that are made in favor of where our church is headed. And every time that we can, we're looking for a win-win scenario. Making young people a priority and giving them a bigger slice, one of the things that it means is simply it's intentionally paying attention to them. It's being in touch with who they are, what they're interested in, and the sorts of things that they care about. An idea that may help you with this, we actually think that looking at your church's budget can be a helpful reflection and manifesto of your priorities in the church. And oftentimes we've seen that if you'll take a look at a church's budget, it will reflect the sorts of things that your church cares about. And we have seen some churches where they're investing a lot of money in the worship ministry. They're investing very little ministry in what's happening with young people. Now, even within the worship ministry, the only way that they have young people in their church is because they are paying those young people to come in and sing, perform, that sort of thing. But one of the ideas for how you can think about doing intergenerational ministry well and making sure you are investing in the right areas is actually chasing down your budget and trying to think through, are there ways that we're intentionally investing in and prioritizing young people throughout all areas of the life of our church, but especially within our worship ministries. We tend to find that a game-changing question in the church can be this one: how might young people be involved? How might young people be involved? We have found churches who have asked that question for a period of several years. And in the first couple of years, there are very few ways they see young people can be involved. But once they ask that question long enough, the right opportunity hit, and they found incredible and important ways for young people to be involved in the life of the service. Now, I may tell a little story about that, depending on if we have time and if it corresponds with one of the questions. But I think the very last thing that I would want to add before I wrap up and start taking questions, so please do type them in if you have them, is simply to start where you are. I think that it can be very difficult to look at where you might want to be at some point down the road and say, well, we're not quite there yet. But to start with where you are in the church and take wherever you are and think about, what does one small next step look like, and go that direction, take that next faithful step, rather than trying to get from A to B if that's a big jump for you. All right, so I am going to turn it over and I am going to take questions. Now, any questions that are related to young people, intergenerational worship, those sort of topics are fair game. So please do type those in if you have them. And I'm going to turn back to Stephen's question. Stephen says, we are also challenged with getting junior high and high school students to actually attend in both worship expressions. I hear this is a growing concern everywhere. Do you believe the worship gathering will become less and less of a priority, even with the overall desired discipleship strategy and ecclesiastical formation of the 21st century church? Great question, Stephen. I am careful about trying to predict the future, but based on my work, I'll offer a couple of comments here. I do hear of churches as well who are really struggling to involve and retain junior high and high school students in the worship service. I have heard people talking for a long time about how the worship service is not really that important, and maybe we can get away from it, and maybe it's going to decline in terms of importance. I know church history that has happened in some cases, and interestingly, it keeps coming back around where worship services do hold a value, I think, sense of ritual and continuity for people. So I would not bet on the worship gathering becoming less and less of a priority. I do think that community and belonging is equally as important, and that will get emphasized. I think of a lot of church plants I know where my sense is after COVID, we're going to see the rise of a lot of micro churches and smaller sense of community and small Bible studies, because people, first of all, can gather in that sense, but they're also hungry for that sense of community. I can't tell you how many church plants I know of that began as a very small Bible study and then a series of Bible studies, and then that eventually morphs into a worship service. The church ends up growing and getting very large, and then they realize we lost the community, so now we need to have the community. So my sense is, if we're talking about a desired discipleship strategy and ecclesiastical formation, I would say it's got to be a balance between the two of those. I don't know if I fully answered your question or if I went kind of beyond your question, but that would be my response there. Any other questions that come to mind as we think about intergenerational worship, as we think about young people? This is an open time for any questions that you all might want to ask. So please do. And I'm going to stay quiet for just a minute. Thanks for the response, Stephen. Glad that one hit the mark for you. Anybody else? I'm curious if there are any other questions that come to mind. I think one thing I would add is this is a hard topic. This is not easy or simple. This really is fairly advanced stuff. So if you find yourself struggling in this area, I just want to say, I think that's okay, and I really do think that God honors some of the challenge and the struggle here. I think we'll give it maybe about 20 more seconds and just see if anyone else has questions. If no one does, then you may have just a little bit of extra time for break before you wrap up and you go to your next session. Okay, we'll make this maybe the last question unless anyone chats it in. So Stephen asked, what am I seeing particularly on the West Coast within youth choirs still being a priority? So I am in California today, and Fuller Seminary is in California. I actually live in Michigan. So I do the back and forth where I've got some of my life in Michigan and some of my life in California. The answer is actually fairly similar. The answer is fairly similar between the two in that we still see churches with thriving youth choirs. It just tends to be the churches that really place a high value on the music there. And I think that youth choirs can be an incredible way to involve students. I will say we have found that adult choirs involving students can be an incredible way to engage students as well. So if you don't have enough young people to get a youth choir going, I would add, we've actually seen a scenario where some churches, they had some teenagers who really did not connect with the youth ministry, but the teenagers were into music and they did connect with the adult choir. So they ended up joining the adult choir and formed relationships with adults in the adult choir. And what ended up happening is when you looked out about 5 years after this whole youth group graduated, some of those with the strongest faith and connection to the church were those who had been involved in the adult choir because those young people had formed the depth of those relationships. Cheryl asked for a couple of resources. And so I am going to chat in a couple of links. The first link that I would chat in is our website at the Fuller Youth Institute. So if you check out the Fuller Youth Institute, we have a blog and series of articles, and you can search worship, and there are all sorts of helpful, practical materials on worship in this area. The other one that I'm going to chat in, some of you may already know about this one, is the Calvin Institute for Christian Worship. I think I have the right one there. Calvin Institute for Christian Worship. They put out a number of helpful resources and materials as well. And John Whitvey and the team there do have some helpful materials on navigating intergenerational worship. So those websites would be two. I am not seeing anything else in the chat, so I think that covers it. So I would say to everyone, you get a few minutes before your next session to take a little break, and I hope that you have a wonderful day.